Now, we all know that Sri Lanka is going through its worst economic crisis since independence. And while this crisis has many dimensions, one important aspect of it is that it's also a debt crisis. Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt external debt almost a year ago in August 2022. And this default, the debt crisis, and the way out of it through debt restructuring was the main focus of our discussions over the last 2 days. And when it comes to debt restructuring, in Sri Lanka, we have very little experience about it, and understandably so. This is the first time in our history that we have defaulted on our debt. And this is also true in many other countries, though some countries have had multiple defaults. So there's much that I think we need to learn and learn very quickly so that our creditors don't get the better of us and exploit us further. Now the economic crisis, the IMF agreement, the process of debt restructuring is also getting considerable attention globally, because Sri Lanka is seen as one of the first of possibly 50 or 70 countries, particularly in the global south, that are facing a tremendous stress in terms of their debt situation. Many of them could possibly default. So what happens in Sri Lanka is also being watched with much interest. So there is a global dimension to it. Now, while in Sri Lanka, the main understanding of this debt crisis is that it was caused by corruption or economic mismanagement, while undeniably there is an element of corruption and economic mismanagement. But when you look at the global character of it, there is also a global political, economic, structural issue here that so many other countries are defaulting. It's not just about the leadership. I mean, we've seen in the Western world, we've seen the leadership of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, and so the leadership of the global order can be questioned as well. But what are the structural reasons for this debt crisis is something that we need to look for, and what are the lessons learned? Is the global economy on the cusp of change? A structural shift is something that we need to think about. When it comes to the debt and the default, first, in Sri Lanka, as in many other countries that have defaulted, there are big questions about, what do we have to do immediately? What kind of what we call a haircut, or how much should the creditors be asked to reduce in terms of the capital that we need to repay? Because having defaulted, what we don't want to see happen is that we say, okay, we've restructured our debt, we are going to pay them back, but it's not sustainable, and then we default again and again, which has happened in many other parts of the world. So we have to reduce our debt stock, and there has to be some fair and just way in which the risk of debt is also absorbed by the creditors. Now, the IMF agreement that was made public, their report on Monday, makes many recommendations that Sri Lanka should achieve a primary surplus next year. That's very soon. A primary surplus means that our revenue should be higher than our expenditure. Now, is this possible when Sri Lanka's primary deficit was about 5.3% in 2021, 3.8% in 2022? How can we, while our economy is collapsing, so quickly achieve a primary surplus? Can we generate that kind of revenues, or is it going to lead to further austerity and further contraction of the economy? What sort of growth should we be looking at? Arguably, our economy, starting with the COVID crisis, and last year, our economy shrunk by 8%. And if you include the last couple of years, last 3-4 years, almost by 20%. So a fifth of our economy has been lost. How are we going to recover? The growth projections in the IMF report, they say that this year again there'll be a 3% contraction, and they say then in the following years maybe 2 to 3% growth. Are we going to be able to recover with that kind of growth? So the question of growth becomes important. The question of inflation and what do we do about inflation? Do we fight inflation with this, we seem to have one big tool, and we seem to use the same tool regardless of what it is, and it's like using a hammer to solve all the problems in our economy, that is to increase interest rates. And interest rates, as you know, the central bank's policy rate is 16.5%. The bank lending rates are now between 25 to 30%, and we are seeing businesses collapse. Even the World Bank says last year 500,000 jobs were lost. Is that the way to move forward? Or is inflation something different, where it was a one-time price hike due to the devaluation of the rupee, due to global commodity price increases, and how should we address that? Because wages have not increased. Last year we saw that food inflation almost doubled. The incomes of day wage laborers, on-skilled labor, was halved. So their incomes have halved, and their food costs have doubled. So they have 1/4 as much money to pay for their food. And this is what we are seeing in terms of the tremendous suffering and levels of even starvation increasing in the country. So what do we do immediately is a question that we have to think about. But in our discussions, we also discussed what are the problems with the mechanisms globally available to address debt and debt restructuring. And we find that those mechanisms are really inadequate to address the problems not only in Sri Lanka, but in many parts of the world. So we need to, from the lessons in Sri Lanka, and we had a very strong presence from Africa in these consultations, very good papers and presentations which have enriched our thinking. Out of that, what kind of new mechanisms or what kind of changes in the mechanisms that exist are necessary to be able to this very widespread debt crisis in the country? And thirdly, is this a moment like the 1930s and 40s when the Bretton Woods institutions, in other words, the IMF and the World Bank were formed, a new financial architecture was created, or in the 1970s when the United States went off the gold standard, when the mandate of the IMF, whatever that might have been, takes a different turn towards structural adjustment? Is this a time for a new global financial architecture given the tremendous problems that we are facing? And those were also part of the discussion, and I think globally there's going to be increasing discussions along those lines of the need for a new global financial architecture. And I think from IDEA's point of view, IDEA's network, some of the discussions that we started here in Colombo, we hope to take to various international forums in terms of the need for such a new global financial architecture. And finally, we also spent considerable amount of time talking about the recent IMF agreement. Many new insights came to us through those discussions, and the panelists here will share some of that, but I just want to highlight a few of them in relation to Sri Lanka. Something that was new to us, pointed to us by Dr. Martin Guzman, the former economy minister of Argentina, who was part of similar negotiations, is that this IMF agreement is also the funds that we get, the loan that we get from the IMF, the interest that we are going to pay for it can be anywhere from 4 to 6.5%. Right? These are interest rates on the order of the extremely high sovereign bonds that we've been floating. So while Sri Lanka has very little foreign exchange, even for the loans that are given to supposedly stabilize us are extremely high interest costs that the people of this country are going to have to pay for. There was a lot of discussion that with the IMF agreement, while it will lead to difficulties for people, that there will be robust social protection, that there would be targeted cash transfers. Now, there's a lot of debate about what kind of social protection we need in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a long history of universal social welfare, free education, free healthcare, until the 1970s, a universal food subsidy. And if we had that today, we won't be facing the kind of starvation that people are facing. But that was gotten rid of with the open economy reforms. So in that context, of course, there are questions about these targeted social transfers and particularly cash transfers, and what happens with inflation to those cash transfers. But even leaving that aside, if you look at the IMF report, they are allocating a mere 0.6% of our GDP for social protection. This is grossly inadequate. And this is what we've been told to wait for a year while our economy contracted by almost a tenth. So that's been a huge disappointment. We need to think about it. And lastly, the primary budget surplus that was mentioned, it seems unrealistic. It's going to bring about tremendous suffering, but even then unrealistic. There is also a lot of talk in the IMF agreement about state-owned enterprise reforms. In other words, privatization. So are we going to see in the next months and years a fire sale of our assets? And is that what's in the cards in terms of a country that has no bargaining power? This is the worst time to privatize, but is that how we are going to pay for both our imports in terms of address the balance of payment problems, as well as raise the revenues to show a primary surplus? So this is going to have long-term implications in terms of our economy, and I think we've already gone through considerable pain over the last year, and the next few years, I would say, there is going to be these dynamics, the fallout of this process the IMF agreement and debt restructuring that is going to change the trajectory, the social, economic, and political trajectory of our country. And all of these we have to be cognizant of. And I think the discussions that were started, hopefully the discussion today, would help us start thinking more and more and deeper about how we are going to address these concerns.